Margaret had been married to Richard for 42 years. 42 years of building a life together, raising 3 children, and creating memories in their modest home on Maple Street. She was 71 now, with silver hair that fell softly to her shoulders and kind eyes that had seen both joy and sorrow. Richard had always been the practical one. A retired accountant, he managed their finances with precision. Margaret trusted him completely. After all, trust was the foundation of their long marriage. Or so she believed. It started with a simple comment one evening in March. "You know, Margaret," Richard said, barely looking up from his newspaper, "you're getting too old for travel. All that walking and planning, it would be too much." For you, Margaret had been suggesting a trip to Italy, just a small one. She'd always dreamed of seeing the Tuscan countryside, tasting authentic pasta, and standing in front of Michelangelo's David. But Richard dismissed it with a wave of his hand. "Maybe you're right," Margaret replied quietly, though something in her heart felt heavy. 3 weeks later, Richard announced he was taking a business trip. "Old client needs help with some accounts," he explained. "I'll be gone about 10 days. Margaret kissed him goodbye at the door, never suspecting anything unusual. But then came the phone call. It was Richard's secretary, Linda, not his current secretary. His former secretary from 20 years ago, the one who had left rather suddenly to move across the country. "Margaret, I'm so sorry to tell you this." Linda's voice trembled through the phone. "But Richard isn't on a business trip. He's in Italy. With me." The words didn't make sense at first. Margaret sat down slowly in her favorite chair, the one by the window where afternoon light always poured warmly. "What do you mean?" Margaret asked, though somewhere deep inside, she already knew. Linda explained everything. She and Richard had been having an affair for 25 years, on and off, secret meetings, hidden phone calls. And now, he'd taken her to Italy. The very trip he'd told Margaret she was too old to enjoy. Margaret sat in silence after hanging up the phone. The house felt different somehow. Quieter, emptier. She didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, something else stirred inside her. Something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Determination. Margaret walked to Richard's study and opened the filing cabinet where he kept all their financial documents. She'd never looked closely before. Richard always said he had it handled. But now she looked, and what she found made her hands shake. Bank statements showing wire transfers she'd never authorized. Credit cards in both their names that she'd never used. Investment accounts she didn't know existed. And then, the most painful discovery. An insurance policy where he'd changed the beneficiary from Margaret to Linda. Her husband hadn't just betrayed her heart. He'd been planning to leave her with nothing. Margaret sat at Richard's desk for a long time, thinking. She thought about their wedding day, about the promises they'd made, about the life she believed they were living together. And then, she made her decision. She called her son, David, an attorney. She explained everything calmly, methodically. David was quiet on the other end, then said, I'll be right over." Together, they worked through the night. Margaret sold Richard's car, the Mercedes he'd bought last year, with their money. She withdrew half of every joint account, which was legally her right. She contacted the insurance company and discovered that because she'd been the original beneficiary and the change was so recent, it could be contested. She gathered every document, every receipt, every piece of evidence, and then she filed for divorce when Richard returned from Italy. 10 days later, tan and relaxed, he walked into a very different home than the one he'd left. The locks had been changed. His clothes were in boxes on the front porch, and taped to the front door was a notice from Margaret's attorney. Richard stood there in shock, his luggage at his feet as neighbors walked by pretending not to notice. He called Margaret's phone. She answered on the 3rd ring. "Margaret, what is this? What's happening?" Her voice was steady, calm. "You told me I was too old to travel, Richard. Too old for new experiences. But you weren't too old to betray me for 25 years. We can talk about this. We will talk," Margaret said, "through our attorneys. You'll find all the documentation you need has been filed. Every secret account, every hidden transfer, everything." There was silence on Richard's end. "I gave you 42 years of my life," Margaret continued. "I raised our children. I supported your career. I trusted you. And you were planning to leave me with nothing. Margaret, please." "The house is in my name, Richard. I checked. My father left it to me, remember? You have no claim to it. The retirement accounts will be split according to law, and I'm sure the court will be very interested in where all that money went." Margaret hung up the phone. In the months that followed, the divorce proceedings revealed everything. Richard had spent over $300,000 on Linda over the years. Vacations, jewelry, even helping to pay her mortgage. Money that should have been securing Margaret's future. The judge was not sympathetic to Richard. Margaret received the house, 3/4 of the retirement funds, and monthly alimony. Richard's attempt to hide assets only made things worse. For him, he ended up having to sell his business partnership to pay what he owed. Linda, it turned out, lost interest quickly once Richard's money problems became apparent. She stopped returning his calls within 6 months. Margaret's children rallied around her. Her daughter, Susan, moved back home for a few months to keep her company. Her sons visited every weekend. They were ashamed of their father, heartbroken for their mother, but also amazed at her strength. "I didn't know you had it in you, Mom," David said one Sunday over coffee. Margaret smiled. "Neither did I. But sometimes life asks us to find strength we didn't know we had." On her 72nd birthday, Margaret did something unexpected. She booked a trip to Italy. She spent 3 weeks traveling through Tuscany, Rome, and Florence. She ate pasta in small trattorias. She stood before Michelangelo's David and wept at its beauty. She made friends with other travelers and laughed more than she had in years. She sent one postcard during the trip. It was addressed to Richard. On it, she'd written simply, "Turns out I wasn't too old after all." When Margaret returned home, she felt different. Lighter. The betrayal still hurt. She knew it might always hurt a little, but she'd survived it. More than survived. She'd reclaimed herself. She started taking art classes at the community center. She joined a book club. She volunteered at the library, reading to children every Thursday afternoon, and when people asked her about the divorce, she simply said, "It taught me that it's never too late to start over. Never too late to stand up for yourself. Never too late to remember who you are." Richard, meanwhile, lived in a small apartment across town. He rarely saw his children. His reputation in the community never recovered. He betrayed not just his wife, but the person who'd loved him most in the world. Sometimes Margaret would think about him, not with anger anymore, but with a kind of sad understanding. He'd traded something real for something false, and now he had neither. She, on the other hand, had discovered something precious, her own resilience, her own worth, her own capacity for joy independent of anyone else. On quiet evenings, sitting in her chair by the window with a cup of tea, Margaret would sometimes smile to herself. She'd been told she was too old for travel, too old for new beginnings, too old to fight back. But she'd proven that wisdom, strength, and the capacity for reinvention have no age limit, and that, she thought, was the sweetest justice of all. Sometimes the greatest act of love is loving yourself enough to walk away from someone who has forgotten your value. Margaret's story reminds us that betrayal, while painful, can also be the doorway to rediscovering our own strength, independence, and capacity for joy.